Metroid Dread has a 16-year-long history, and several other YouTubers have delved into the topic already, explaining some of the game's origins, but we weren't satisfied with the info that's available. That's why for this video, we hunted down seasoned Metroid developers for exclusive interviews, and translated magazines into English for the first time to get the complete story of Dread's development. So without further delay, let's jump into it. Metroid Dread's story begins at E3 2005. Reggie revealed the new Game Boy Micro. Iwata revealed not only the Wii, but also a brand new concept called the Virtual Console. And then the show went horribly off script when Miyamoto revealed Nintendogs, then his dog Mario immediately started humping his co-host's dog. Yeah, that wasn't supposed to happen. But there was another thing that was supposed to happen, but didn't. Reggie showed off a slew of upcoming DS games, like New Super Mario Bros., Animal Crossing, and Castlevania. But the day before their presentation, Nintendo showed a few game journalists an off-the-record peek at an internal product sheet listing all these games, plus one more, Metroid Dread. Somewhere in that 24-hour window, Nintendo decided to cut Dread from their presentation. The staff of Game Informer magazine had already seen the product sheet, so in their next issue they included Metroid Dread on a list of DS games scheduled for release in 2006. Nintendo fans were thoroughly confused, as they'd never even heard of Metroid Dread and couldn't find information about it anywhere. Yet here it was in Game Informer, no explanation given. So of course, fans speculated, and rumors spread on internet message boards. Eventually, one of those fans asked IGN editor Craig Harris about Dread, as he was one of the few people who saw the E3 spreadsheet. Harris responded publicly that Metroid Dread was in fact real, and that it would probably show up next year. But what exactly did Craig and the other journalist elites see on that spreadsheet? A few years later, Craig was the host of IGN's Nintendo Voice Chat podcast, where he said this.
Well, they still have Metroid Dread, at least the script for it, and I bring it up every single time, and they do have the story. I mean, I saw the synopsis of the game, and I know it exists, and they pulled the plug at the last minute. So, I mean, I know that exists, and they can always bring it back.
A short version of this quote made its way onto Metroid wikis and YouTube videos in the decades since, and before Dread's official announcement in 2021, it was arguably the most prominent piece of evidence touted by fans. Many of them believed Dread had a full script and was decently far into development, but that doesn't appear to be the case. Last year, we contacted Greg to ask about his podcast and what exactly he saw at E3 2005. We'll throw up his full, unedited explanation on screen if you want to pause and read it, but the short version is that the product sheet only had a one-paragraph description, and it basically just said something like, "Samus is back in the next game in the Metroid series." In other words, the journalists were never shown any script, and it doesn't seem a script ever existed. In 2015, gaming historian and longtime DidYouKnowGaming collaborator Liam Robertson conducted a series of interviews with Nintendo developers. Speaking anonymously, one developer who worked on Nintendo's Japanese teams explained that work on Dread began in 2005. They went on to state that it only existed as design documents and ideas among certain staff members, including Sakamoto, but they never even got as far as pre-production. This lines up with what Sakamoto would eventually reveal in a 2021 roundtable interview, where he said, 15 years ago when I originally conceived of the game, the story itself wasn't clearly set. It's fairly recent we finalized the detailed story, so you can imagine what I had envisioned 15 years ago is not the same as what has been achieved now. It consisted of Samus facing a dreadful opponent, a dreadful experience. At that time, I hadn't developed in detail the storyline within the overall chronology and background of the series. Over the course of several more interviews, he went on to say that the DS hardware just wasn't powerful enough to bring the game to life. But the fact Metroid Dread was little more than an abandoned idea was never communicated to the fans back in 2005, so all they could do was wait for the next E3, then the next one. But both events came and went without a peep. Then in late 2007, Metroid Prime 3 hit store shelves, and within 24 hours, fans discovered a panel near the end of the game that said, "Metroid Project Dread is nearing the final stages of completion," which sent half the fanbase into a frenzy, thinking it was a hint that Dread was finally within reach. But the other half of the fanbase drew the opposite conclusion, that Dread had been cancelled, because the panel right next to it said the experiment was unsuccessful, and Project Dread had failed. Prime 3's senior producer Bryan Walker and director Mark Pacini both denied the scans were meant as a clue, explaining they were actually, quote, "a fictional element of something else in the game that by a large coincidence could be read that we were giving a hint about Metroid Dread, which was not the case. It's a complete and utter coincidence. During our research for this video, we had a 1-hour Zoom call with Bryan Walker. By now, he's been gone from Retro Studios for almost a decade, so he's in a much better position to open up about old secrets, and he was actually. He told us about cancelled prototypes, cut content in the Prime trilogy, and lots more behind-the-scenes secrets which we'll share in some upcoming videos. But as far as the Dread reference, he said he knew who added it into the game, but he swore it really was just a weird coincidence. In fact, Nintendo and Miyamoto in particular had pretty strict rules preventing them from hiding Easter eggs. And besides, Retro was completely out of the loop on what Nintendo was doing with the main series, so they couldn't have hinted at Dread's development even if they'd wanted to. In reality, it was actually 1 year later in 2008 that Sakamoto restarted development, although this time it wasn't Dread, but an entirely different 2D Metroid. In 2015, several of Liam Robertson's sources inside Nintendo revealed the game was extensively prototyped in a 2D sprite art style, with one developer saying, quote, "It literally looked like a port of Fusion on DS." At this point, it wasn't being called Dread anymore, and its working title was simply Metroid. Staff from first-party development houses were invited to see an early version of Metroid at a pre-E3 event in 2009, but the game dropped off the radar soon after. If you're skeptical about information coming from anonymous sources, as you probably should be, it's worth noting that bits and pieces were later confirmed by Sakamoto himself 6 years later. In fact, since Metroid 2008 was completely different and went by a different codename, you could argue it wasn't Metroid Dread at all. Rather, it was just another failed attempt at restarting 2D Metroid. Maybe we're slicing the onion a little too thinly, but what Sakamoto did make clear was that because of the franchise's middling sales history, Nintendo simply wasn't willing to give him a AAA development team. He continued to think about it even into the 3DS era, but still wasn't able to put together the dream team the project required. Unbeknownst to Sakamoto, the team he needed was currently being formed halfway across the world. A small studio in Spain called Mercury Steam had only made 3 games, none of which were of particular note, like American McGee Presents Scrapland. But that all changed when Konami gave them the opportunity of a lifetime with the chance to reboot the Castlevania franchise in 3D. With a little help from Hideo Kojima, their first entry in 2010, called Lords of Shadow, took on a more God of War-like style and went on to become the best-selling Castlevania game of all time. Following its success, Konami contracted Mercury Steam to produce 2 more Castlevanias, the direct sequel, Lords of Shadow 2, and the much more Metroidvania-style Mirror of Fate for Nintendo 3DS. Unfortunately, neither game managed to achieve the sales success of their predecessor, and Konami was already pivoting away from games and towards pachinko, so they let the franchise die and another Castlevania game was never produced. Well, unless you count the mobile games and pachinko machines. So in an effort to jump from one series to another, Mercury Steam started prototyping a Metroid game to pitch to Nintendo. According to Spanish developers who interviewed for the project, as well as Liam Robertson's sources, Mercury Steam wanted to make a first-person Metroid game for Wii U taking place in a post-apocalyptic setting. Similar to Metroid Prime Hunters, the player could also choose from either Samus or 6 other bounty hunters to complete the game's main campaign. Supplementing the Wii U title, a 3DS companion game was also planned. Nintendo rejected Mercury Steam's pitch, but word eventually made its way to Sakamoto that the Castlevania team was pushing hard to get into Metroid. So he sat down with his 3DS and played Mirror of Fate, and was super impressed. So Sakamoto flew to Spain to meet the developers face to face. Mercury Steam said, "Okay, we guess Nintendo didn't like our 3D pitch, so how about a modern 2D remake of Metroid Fusion?" Sakamoto told them he was more interested in a Metroid 2 remake. The Game Boy original was the only mainline game he wasn't personally involved with, and it tells an essential part of the series' lore. Sakamoto also thought, with the recent success of Metroidvanias in the indie scene, that now was a good time to ask Nintendo to let him make one of his own. Talking to Comics Gaming magazine, he said, "There's a thirst for that genre. People are excited about this genre, and so from a marketing standpoint, understanding that this market exists, it's been helpful to have all of these people clamoring for them. It gave me the momentum to say, hey, look at this thing I've been talking about. Well, I think this is the right time." 2 years later, Samus Returns launched on 3DS to critical acclaim, and even won Best Handheld at the 2017 Game Awards. But even more importantly, Sakamoto loved it. So before it was finished, he'd already decided Mercury Steam was the team he'd been looking for to resurrect Metroid Dread. If you finish Samus Returns with 100% item completion, you get to see a mysterious Chozo memory with dreadful music playing over it. Sakamoto told Spanish outlet Hobby Consolas it was certainly hinting at something, but wouldn't say what. In hindsight, it's clear this was Ravenbeak having just killed the 6 Chozo overseers, and the memory itself was a sign that Metroid Dread was already in the works. 16 years after it all started, Nintendo finally revealed Metroid Dread at E3 2021. And even more than Samus Returns, Dread borrowed substantial elements from Mercury Steam's Castlevania games. Traditionally, both the Castlevania and Metroid series used a static side-scrolling camera, but Mirror of Fate introduced a cinematic camera most often used in boss fights. This exact same camera system was incorporated into Metroid Dread, and according to Sakamoto, adding it to Metroid was Mercury Steam's idea, as was Samus's melee counter, which is essentially a mix of the block and grab maneuvers used by Castlevania's Belmonts. Dread also uses a good deal of QuickTime events in its boss fights, and for the first time in the series, introduces map markers to help the player return to hidden areas after they've acquired the necessary upgrades. 2 more mechanics taken from Mirror of Fate. But Sakamoto and Mercury Steam weren't content to just inject Dread with new school Castlevania. They also wanted to bring back old school Metroid. While Super Metroid was famous for its sequence breaking, that is, giving the player the chance to obtain key items out of order, the previous mainline game in the series, Metroid Fusion, didn't include a single sequence break. According to Dread's director Jose Luis Marquez, they intentionally left in tons of opportunities to sequence break, and are expecting hardcore fans to find some breaks they didn't even know were possible. One of these intentional breaks actually has a hidden cutscene. With a well-timed slide jump, players can get the bombs early, then use them to launch directly into Kraid's belly for an insta-kill. Or, if you sequence break to get the flash shift early, you can jump between Kraid's teeth and unload a barrage of missiles. As far as sequence breaks the developers didn't plan, a good example is getting the Phantom Cloak before the Charge Beam, which is usually the very first upgrade. Using a glitch maneuver called the Pseudo Plasma Beam, it's possible to blow up this ceiling and make your way to the boss Corpius earlier than intended. When Samus kills Corpius in the cutscene that follows, she uses her Charge Beam, despite the fact she hasn't obtained it yet. In an interview with Hobby Consolas about Samus Returns, but probably even more applicable to Metroid Dread, Marquez said, "Let's just say there are parts where we allowed sequence breaking, and others where, for whatever reason, we weren't interested in allowing it. But people broke it anyway. We've seen things we never would have been able to imagine possible. In reality, it's hard to stop sequence breaking if the player really wants to do it. There are always so many talented people with so much time, with so many skills that can skip." To learn more about these skips Mercury Steam never imagined, we talked to some of those talented people Marquez was talking about, like Bane, one of the fastest Dread fans on the planet. Players have to reach Samus's ship in under 4 hours to get the best ending, but Bane held the world record with a time of just 1 hour and 10 minutes. He told us about camera lock, a glitch where reloading the melee tutorial several times locks the camera into this exact position, and at the same time all the destructible blocks, doors, gates, and water essentially disappear from the rest of Arteria. From there, you have to run all the way across the map blind, using nothing but sound to reach this room where you can obtain the screw attack early, which lets you skip ever having to come back to Frozen Arteria, including the boss fight against Experiment Z57. It's a pretty tricky sequence break, but speedrunners like Bane could pull it off in under a minute. A few other tricks probably weren't intended either, like the water bomb glitch that lets you reach underwater ledges before the game plans you to. With Metroid Dread just a few months old and speedrunners already beating it in 70 minutes, the big question is, will anyone ever beat it in under an hour? Bane told us unless some revolutionary new glitch is discovered, it's simply not possible. Those sentiments were echoed by Oatngoats, the world record holder for hard mode, who told us, "With the knowledge of the game that we have now, I would have to say no, I do not think that sub 1 hour is possible. But I do believe there will be many new tricks and glitches discovered that open the door for much lower times, but only time will tell if sub 1 is an actual possibility. I have no doubt that the Dread team put in a number of creative ways to beat the game. This game is still very new and has plenty of maturing to do, so once time has passed, I'm sure we will find even more paths to the end." Mercury Steam have said they keep an eye on the speedrunning community, and Oatngoats says at least one of them has watched him live on Twitch. He also pointed out the devs made pre-rendered loading screens for every area with every suit, including the standard power suit, which means they suspected someone could beat the game without a single suit upgrade. Following in the steps of Super Metroid, it seems they crafted Metroid Dread as an open invitation to countless unique paths, sequence breaks, and tricks the developers themselves didn't even know were possible. Speedrunners like Bane and Oatngoats continue to battle it out to become the fastest in the world, but if they'll ever be able to beat a game that took 16 years to make in a single hour, well, only time will tell. Did you also know that Japan got an exclusive Metroid game that never came to the West? Or that there's dozens of cancelled Mario games we never saw? For more facts, check out our videos on Metroid Invasion Order or every cancelled Mario game. Subscribe if you want to see more videos like this, and leave a comment on what games you'd like to see us cover next. Also, a huge thanks to the guys at Retro for sharing their stories with us. And thank you for watching.